September 1914, northern France. A Bavarian infantry regiment rises from their trenches in darkness, moving silently across no man's land toward French positions. If they can catch the enemy by surprise, they might break through the deadlock that has paralysed the Western Front. Every step closer to the French lines ratchets up their anxiety. Discovery in the open would mean catastrophe. Then the searchlights find them. A mile behind the French trenches sit 4 cannons. Each one weighs just 2,650 pounds, light enough to be pulled by a team of horses. They look almost delicate compared to the massive siege guns thundering elsewhere on the battlefield. But appearances are deceiving. The French battery commander gives a simple order: 30 rounds per gun, as fast as possible. What happened next changed warfare forever. The German regiment ceased to exist in less than 2 minutes. No man's land became a hell of high explosive and shrapnel. 120 shells, each carrying either 12 pounds of high explosive or hundreds of steel balls, transformed organised infantry into chaos. The survivors broke and ran. The 4 guns fired another 80 rounds into the fleeing Germans, completing the rout. A single battery had destroyed an entire regiment in the time it takes to brew a pot of coffee. The weapon that accomplished this massacre was the Matériel de 75 mm Model 1897. The French called it Mademoiselle 75, Miss 75. Allied soldiers simply called it the French 75, and it was the most revolutionary artillery piece in history. Before 1897, artillery was simple. You aimed the gun, you fired. The gun jumped backwards several feet from the recoil, then you pushed it back into position, re-aimed, and fired again. This process took time, a lot of time. Even the best crews could manage maybe 2 or 3 rounds per minute. The French 75 could fire 20. Some exceptional crews hit 30 rounds per minute, a rate of fire comparable to a machine gun. This wasn't an incremental improvement. This was artillery that operated at 10 times the speed of everything that came before it. When armies around the world first heard rumours about the French 75's capabilities, they assumed the French were lying. Nothing could fire that fast, not with accuracy, not without destroying itself. They were wrong. The story of how the French 75 came to be is a tale of secrecy, obsession, and brilliant engineering. It begins in 1870 with France's humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the German siege of Paris, the fall of Napoleon III, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. These wounds cut deep into the French national psyche. For the next 40 years, every decision the French military made was shaped by one question: how do we beat the Germans next time? By the early 1890s, European artillery was in crisis. Improvements in explosives and metallurgy had created far more powerful cannon, but recoil was destroying them. Field guns light enough to be mobile would literally fly off their wheels when fired. Heavier guns stayed in place but required extensive repositioning after every shot. The solution everyone was pursuing involved reducing recoil through mechanical brakes and heavy construction, but this made guns slow and cumbersome. In 1892, General Charles Mathieu, France's director of artillery, received intelligence that sent him into action. The Germans were testing a revolutionary new cannon design based on something called the long recoil principle. A German engineer named Konrad Hausner had patented a system using oil and compressed air to absorb recoil. Krupp was testing it. Mathieu didn't wait. He summoned the directors of France's arsenals. Could such a system actually work? The answer from most was immediate. No, impossible. The pressures involved would be too great. Hydraulic fluid would leak through any seal. The idea was theoretically sound, but practically impossible. Most said no. But Colonel Albert Duport, director of the Châtillon Commentary Gun Foundry at Puteaux, just outside Paris, asked for 3 days to study the problem. When he returned, his answer was different. Yes, it could be done. What happened next was extraordinary. General Mathieu initiated a secret weapons program without approval from his superiors, without signed contracts, without official authorization. Money supposedly earmarked to purchase property around Paris was quietly diverted. Eventually, 300 million francs flowed into the project. In 1892, that was roughly $60 million, an enormous sum. The secrecy was absolute. All correspondence was classified. Duport reported directly to Mathieu weekly, But everything was verbal or in sealed documents. The program didn't officially exist. If it failed, Mathieu's career would be destroyed. If it succeeded, France would have the most advanced artillery in the world. Deport's specifications called for a 75mm caliber weapon. This was smaller than many field guns of the era, but the French had a specific purpose in mind. They wanted a gun that could shred infantry formations in the open with rapid shrapnel fire. The caliber mattered less than the rate of fire. The heart of the weapon would be its recoil system. Beneath the gun barrel, Deport designed a cradle holding two hydraulic cylinders. The upper cylinder contained hydraulic fluid. The lower cylinder contained compressed gas. Between them sat a floating piston, a precisely machined component that kept the fluid and gas separated. The principle was elegant. When the gun fired, the barrel recoiled backward. This forced the hydraulic fluid through a port into the second cylinder, compressing the gas. The compression absorbed the recoil energy progressively as internal pressure rose. At maximum recoil, when the barrel had travelled back as far as it would go, the compressed gas was under enormous pressure. Then the system reversed. The compressed gas pushed against the floating piston, forcing the fluid back through the port into the first cylinder. This returned the barrel smoothly to its original firing position. The gun carriage itself never moved, not an inch. According to later calculations, the energy released when the gun fired was equal to stopping an automobile travelling at 100 miles per hour within a space of 3 feet. All that energy was absorbed by the hydro-pneumatic system and converted into the smooth return stroke that repositioned the barrel automatically. Legend says you could place a glass of water on one of the gun's wheels during firing. It wouldn't spill. That's probably an exaggeration, but it captures the revolutionary nature of the system. Previous field guns jumped backward violently. The French 75 barely trembled. Deport borrowed features from other designs where they made sense. The breech assembly was a Nordenfelt type, a rotating block with a notch cut into one side. Rotate the block. The notch exposes the chamber for loading. Rotate it back, the chamber seals. Simple and fast. From an earlier French 57mm gun, Deport adapted the separate sighting device that moved independently from the barrel, and a collimator, a fixed telescope for direct fire aiming. Because the gun stayed still during firing, crew protection became practical. A shield could be added without interfering with the recoil. A seat for the gunner made sense because he wouldn't be thrown around. These seem like small details, but they were revolutionary. They were only possible because of the recoil system. Everything depended on making that recoil system work. In 1892, Deport handed this challenge to Captain Saint-Clair Deville, a gifted and relentless engineer. Deville would spend the next 5 years solving problem after problem. The first prototypes failed immediately. The pressures involved were enormous. Bronze cylinders cast for the first tests literally oozed hydraulic fluid through their pores. The metal wasn't strong enough. Deville switched to machined steel. That solved the oozing problem but created others. The seal on the floating piston had to be perfect. Any mixing of hydraulic fluid and compressed gas would destroy the system's function. Deville tested dozens of designs. Each one leaked. In December 1894, Colonel Deport was passed over for promotion and resigned in frustration to join a private armaments firm. But the work continued. Deville and another engineer, Captain Émile Remalho, carried on the project. They finally perfected the leak-proof seal in 1896. They called their creation Frein 2, break number 2. Field testing began in 1894 with promising but imperfect results. By 1896, the system worked. In March 1898, the French army officially adopted the Matériel de 75mm Modèle, 1897. Public unveiling came in the summer of 1899. The gun that emerged from this secret program was sleek for its time. The barrel was 8 feet 3 inches long. Total weight with carriage was 2,560 pounds. It could elevate from -11 degrees to +18 degrees and traverse 6 degrees left or right. These weren't exceptional numbers. What was exceptional was what happened when you pulled the firing lanyard. A well-trained crew could fire 15 rounds per minute with ease. Exceptional crews hit 20 rounds per minute. A few managed 30, though this required perfect coordination and couldn't be sustained for long. At that peak rate, the gun finished its recoil cycle and was ready to fire again every 2 seconds. The crew had to load, aim adjust if necessary, and fire in that window. Let's put those numbers in context. Previous field guns fired 2, maybe 3 rounds per minute. The French 75 fired 20. That's not twice as fast, that's 10 times as fast. A single French 75 battery of 4 guns could deliver as much firepower as an entire battalion of older artillery. The ammunition was equally revolutionary. Each shell was fixed to a brass cartridge case holding the propellant charge. No separate loading of shell and powder. The brass case was extracted automatically when the breech opened, ejected, and the gun was ready for the next round. This unitary ammunition, combined with the fast-action breech and the stable platform created by the recoil system, enabled the unprecedented rate of fire. The French had 2 main shell types initially. A shrapnel round weighing about 12 pounds contained steel balls and a time delay fuse. Set correctly, the shell would explode above enemy troops, showering them with hundreds of steel projectiles. It was devastating against infantry in the open. The high explosive round used melinite, a powerful explosive that created both blast and fragmentation effects. Maximum effective range was about 8,500 meters, roughly 5.3 miles. Later in the war, improved ammunition extended this to 11,000 meters. Muzzle velocity was 1,735 feet per second for shrapnel rounds. The shells arrived fast and in volume. But here's what made the French 75 truly revolutionary. Because the gun didn't need to be re-aimed after each shot, because the crew could gather close around it behind the shield, because the breech cycled so smoothly, the entire firing process became almost mechanical. Load, fire, extract, load, fire, extract. Over and over. A well-drilled crew could maintain this rhythm until their ammunition was exhausted, or their barrels overheated. The French understood they had created something extraordinary. They also understood that every other power would try to copy it, so they clamped down with absolute secrecy. Performance figures were classified. Range, rate of fire, shell weight, everything. Long prison terms were mandated for unauthorized disclosure. But the real secrecy surrounded the recoil mechanism, specifically that floating piston and its seal. This was the technical breakthrough that made everything else possible, and the French were determined to protect it. Production of components was deliberately scattered across France. No single facility knew what the others were making. Only a few trusted individuals at final assembly actually understood the complete recoil system. In the field, maintenance regulations carefully specified which parts could be disassembled. The recuperator, the core of the recoil system, was strictly off-limits. Not even French artillery officers were allowed to see the floating piston when it was removed from the gun. This secrecy created confusion among foreign intelligence services. The Germans, having obtained a photograph of the new French gun, attempted to dismiss it. One German officer called it a giant cigar holder. Others went to the opposite extreme, attributing impossible capabilities to it. Rumours circulated of ranges exceeding 10 miles, of shrapnel that could penetrate armour, of high explosive shells that could destroy fortifications. None of this was true, but the French said nothing to correct these misconceptions. Between 1898 and 1914, France produced and deployed over 4,000 French 75s while protecting the core secrets of its design. It was one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. The first combat test came during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. French forces in China used the 75 against Boxer positions and fortifications. Its rapid fire and mobility proved decisive. Other powers took note. An arms race began. By 1914, most major European militaries had adopted quick-firing field guns in the 75 to 77 mm range, but none matched the French 75's rate of fire or sophistication. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the French army fielded about 4,000 French 75s, organised into roughly 1,000 batteries of 4 guns each. This represented the core of French artillery power. The Germans had more guns overall and significantly more heavy artillery, but the French 75 gave France a crucial advantage in field artillery. The gun's first major test came in September 1914, at the Battle of the Marne, the engagement that stopped the German advance on Paris and arguably saved France from defeat in the opening months of the war. By early September 1914, the situation was desperate. German armies had swept through Belgium and northern France, driving the British and French into retreat. Paris seemed doomed. The French government evacuated to Bordeaux. The German First Army under General Alexander von Kluck was approaching the Marne River, just 40 kilometres from the capital. General Joseph Joffre, commander of French forces, made a critical decision. Instead of continuing the retreat, the French would turn and counterattack. On September 5th, French forces stopped retreating and prepared to attack. The Battle of the Marne had begun. The French 75 was everywhere. Batteries positioned along the Marne Valley poured fire into advancing German units. The rate of fire was staggering. German infantry advancing in formation found themselves caught in storms of shrapnel. One French battery commander later wrote that his guns fired continuously for 6 hours, expending over 500 rounds per gun. That's one battery. Thousands of French 75s were in action across the battlefield. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. German soldiers had never experienced such sustained, accurate artillery fire. They'd expected the usual pattern of artillery bombardment, intense but brief, with long pauses while guns were repositioned. The French 75 didn't pause, it just kept firing, and firing, and firing. Contemporary accounts from German units described the experience as nightmarish. One German regiment advancing across open ground was pinpointed by French searchlights, and nearby French 75 batteries poured fire into the formation, quickly overwhelming the Germans' ability to continue their attack warfare history network. After the initial barrage broke the attack, the guns fired additional rounds into the retreating Germans, completing the route warfare history network. The Battle of the Marne lasted from September 5th to September 12th, 1914. French casualties totaled around 250,000, with approximately 80,000 killed. German casualties were similar, around 250,000. British losses were about 13,000. But the strategic result was decisive. The German advance stopped. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for quick victory in the West, had failed. The French 75 was considered the best field gun of the war, and it gave its best performances during the Battle of the Marne in August through September 1914 Wikipedia. French artillery, dominated by the 75, had been crucial in stopping the German advance. The gun designed for rapid fire against troops in the open had performed exactly as intended. But warfare was about to change. After the Marne, both sides dug in. Trenches spread across the landscape. The war of movement became the war of position, and in this new reality the French 75 faced a problem. It was designed to kill soldiers in the open with shrapnel. Soldiers in trenches and bunkers needed different treatment. They needed high explosive shells in quantity, and heavier guns with plunging fire. The French military establishment had believed so completely in the French 75 that they'd neglected development of heavier artillery. In 1914, France had only 544 guns heavier than 75 mm. Germany had thousands of heavy guns and howitzers. This would prove costly, but the French adapted. High explosive shells became the standard ammunition. Impact fuses replaced time fuses. The 75 couldn't collapse bunkers or destroy deep fortifications, but it could cut barbed wire, suppress machine guns, break up attacks, and support infantry advances. And it could do all of this faster than any other field gun. The supreme test came at Verdun in 1916, the longest and bloodiest single battle of World War I. On February 21, 1916, the Germans launched Operation Gericht Judgment against the French fortress complex at Verdun. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, had developed a strategy of attrition. He would attack Verdun, a place of immense symbolic importance to France. The French would have to defend it. German artillery would destroy French units as they reinforced. France would bleed white. At 4 a.m. on February 21, 1916, the battle began with a massive artillery bombardment and a steady advance by troops of the German Fifth Army Imperial War Museums. The opening barrage was unprecedented. Over 1,200 German guns, including enormous 420mm howitzers, pounded French positions for 9 hours. 2 million shells fell on the first day alone. French defenders were initially overwhelmed. 5 days into the battle, German forces captured Fort Douaumont, the largest and highest of the 19 forts protecting Verdun Imperial War Museums. The situation looked hopeless. But General Philippe Pétain took command of the defence and immediately began reorganising French artillery. This was crucial. French positions had inadequate artillery at the start of the battle. Pétain changed this. He used the Sacred Way, the road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, to rush thousands of troops and hundreds of guns to the front. By June 1916, the amount of French artillery at Verdun had increased to 2,708 guns, including 138 French 75mm field guns fandom. Over 1,000 French 75s, organised into 250 batteries, were constantly in action during the battle. Day and night, for nearly 9 months these guns fired. The scale of ammunition consumption was staggering. At Verdun, over 1,000 French 75s were constantly in action, night and day, on the battlefield during a period of nearly 9 months, and the total consumption of 70 Finvossymeter shells at Verdun during the period February 21st to September 30th, 1916, is documented to have been in excess of 16 million rounds, or nearly 70% of all shells fired by French artillery during that battle. Wikipedia. Think about that number, 16 million shells from French 75s alone at Verdun in 7 months. That's over 70,000 shells per day, every day, for 7 months. The French 75 batteries never stopped. When one battery ran low on ammunition, another took over the fire mission. Crews rotated through the batteries, but the guns kept firing. German attacks repeatedly broke against this wall of fire. When German infantry tried to advance, French 75s caught them in the open and shredded them. When German artillery tried to suppress French guns, there were simply too many French 75s, spread across too many positions. The Germans couldn't silence them all. In October 1916, the French launched a counter-offensive to recapture Fort Douaumont. In a 6-day preliminary bombardment, the French artillery fired 264 shells, including 532,126 70mm field gun shells from more than 700 guns and howitzers fandom. That's over 500,000 75mm shells in 6 days of preparatory fire. The French 75 couldn't do everything. It couldn't destroy deep fortifications. It couldn't match the destructive power of heavy howitzers, but it could maintain sustained, accurate fire at a rate no other field gun could match. And in a battle of attrition, where both sides were trying to exhaust the other, this mattered enormously. By December 1916, the Battle of Verdun ended essentially where it began. Both sides had suffered roughly 350,000 casualties each, with about 300,000 killed total. Neither side won a decisive victory, but France had held, and French artillery, dominated by the French 75, had been crucial to that defence. The French 75 was a devastating anti-personnel weapon against waves of infantry attacking in the open, as at the Marne and Verdun. Wikipedia. Even in trench warfare, where its limitations as a light field gun were apparent, its rapid fire made it invaluable. The scale of French 75 production during the war was staggering. France entered the war with about 4,100 guns. By the end, over 1,700 French 75s had been produced. That's an average of about 9 guns per day for 4.5 years. All essential components, including barrels and the complex recoil mechanisms, were manufactured in French state arsenals at Puteaux, Bourges, Châtellerault and Saint-Étienne. Ammunition production was even more impressive. Over 200 million 75mm shells were produced during the war. In 1914, French factories produced about 20,000 shells per day. By 1915, this had increased to 100,000 per day. To achieve this, the government turned to civilian contractors, which created quality control problems. In 1915, defects in shell manufacturing led to an epidemic of burst barrels. Thousands of French 75s were damaged. Colonel Saint-Clair de Ville, one of the original designers, was brought in to solve the crisis. He identified the problem, microfissures in the shell bases caused by manufacturing shortcuts, and implemented corrections. By September 1915, shell quality had recovered. The French 75 also found new roles as the war progressed. In 1913, a truck-mounted anti-aircraft version had been developed. As aircraft became more important, these mobile AA guns became crucial for defending against German bombers and observation aircraft. By 1918, the French 75 was France's primary platform for delivering chemical weapons. Gas shells filled with phosgene or mustard gas were fired in enormous quantities. The rapid rate of fire of the 75 made it ideal for saturating areas with toxic gas before enemies could don masks. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the American Expeditionary Force faced a severe problem. American artillery was hopelessly obsolete. the US opted to adopt French and British weapons rather than design new ones from scratch. The Americans manufactured about 1,050 French 75s domestically under license and imported thousands more from France. The first American shell fired in World War I came on October 23, 1917, from a 75-mm gun, M1897, the US designation, nicknamed Bridget in Battery C, 6th Field Artillery History Net. American artillery units loved the French 75. It was reliable, relatively easy to train on, and its rapid fire provided excellent support for attacking infantry. By the end of the war, French 75s equipped the majority of American field artillery batteries in France. The hydro-pneumatic recoil system remained a source of fascination and frustration for the Americans. The French military mission was reluctant to disclose the inner workings of the recoil system, leading one American officer to remark that the French would sooner lose the war than lose the secret of the 75 Wikipedia. Eventually, the Singer Manufacturing Company undertook the enormous task of reverse engineering and mass-producing the complex recuperator mechanism. According to artillery historian Frank Comparato, it was one of the most complicated engineering tasks ever attempted, one of the marvels of modern industry. The French 75's influence extended beyond France and America. Many countries adopted it during and after the war. Poland, Belgium, Portugal, Romania, Greece, Serbia and others fielded French 75s. Even Germany used captured French 75s after France's fall in 1940. The gun served in conflicts around the world, from the Polish Bolshevik War of 1919 to 1921 to the Spanish Civil War to World War II. As World War II approached, the French 75 was clearly obsolete by modern standards. Its range was too short, its shell too light, and its mobility too limited for modern mechanized warfare. But several thousand French 75s were still in French service in 1940, updated with pneumatic tyres for truck towing. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, French 75s fought again. They were no match for German tanks and modern artillery, but they remained useful for supporting infantry and providing defensive fire. After France's surrender, the Germans designated captured French 75s as the 7-point Fmcms FK-97-F and used them for training, coastal defence and anti-partisan operations. The Americans continued using the French 75 in the early years of World War II. When the attack on Pearl Harbor came in December 1941, French 75s were among the artillery pieces defending the Philippines. A crash program mounted French 75s on M3 half-track chassis to create the M3 gun motor carriage, an interim tank destroyer. These served until dedicated tank destroyers could be fielded. The French 75's armour-piercing round could penetrate 3 inches of armour at 1,000 yards, respectable for the early war period. By 1944, the French 75 had finally been phased out of frontline service with major powers, replaced by more modern designs. But its influence persisted. The hydro-pneumatic recoil system it pioneered became standard on artillery worldwide. Its emphasis on rapid fire, mobile deployment and crew protection became fundamental design principles. The French 75 set the pattern for field artillery that persisted through World War II and beyond. In the end, the statistics tell the story. Over 21,000 French 75s were produced between 1897 and 1940. Over 200 million shells were manufactured for it. It served in both world wars and numerous smaller conflicts. It was used by at least 15 different countries, and for nearly 2 decades, from 1897 to roughly 1915, it was the most advanced field gun in the world. But statistics don't capture the human reality. The French 75 changed warfare by making artillery fast. Before the French 75, artillery prepared attacks and responded to threats. After the French 75, artillery could shape the battlefield in real time. It could break up attacks as they developed, support advancing infantry continuously, and maintain fire for hours or days without pause. German soldiers who survived barrages from French 75s described the experience as hellish. The shells arrived in continuous streams. There was no pause, no reprieve. You couldn't wait out a French 75 battery. It would just keep firing until you were dead or it ran out of ammunition. French and American artillerymen developed an almost affectionate relationship with the gun. It was reliable. It rarely broke down. The recoil system, despite its complexity, was remarkably robust. Crews learned to trust it. When you loaded a shell and pulled the lanyard, The gun fired, recoiled smoothly, and was ready to fire again in 2 seconds. Every time. Thousands of times. That reliability built confidence. The gun also inspired a famous cocktail. The French 75 cocktail, gin or cognac with champagne, lemon juice and sugar, was named after the gun for its powerful kick. Even in popular culture, the French 75 became synonymous with devastating impact. Today, surviving French 75s can be found in military museums around the world. The Musée de l'Armée in Paris has several. The US National World War I Museum in Kansas City displays an American-produced version. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra preserves one with markings showing it was manufactured in 1916. These museum pieces are silent now, but they represent a revolution. The French 75 proved that artillery didn't have to be slow and cumbersome. It could be fast, accurate, mobile and devastating. The engineers who created it, working in secret in the 1890s, couldn't have imagined the impact their creation would have. They were trying to build a better field gun. They built the gun that set the standard for the 20th century. In 1892, when Colonel Deport agreed to attempt the impossible, when he committed to building a gun that could fire 20 times per minute without moving, he was embarking on one of the most significant weapons development programs in history. The hydro-pneumatic recoil system he and his team created would influence artillery design for over a century. The secrecy surrounding the French 75 was both necessary and remarkable. In an era before modern intelligence services, before satellite reconnaissance and electronic espionage, France managed to protect the core technical details of its superweapon for over 2 decades. Even after the gun entered service, even after it proved itself in combat, the specific details of that floating piston and its seal remained classified. This allowed France to maintain a crucial technological advantage in field artillery from 1897 through the opening years of World War I. By the time other nations fully understood and replicated the French 75's recoil system, France had produced thousands of the guns and trained tens of thousands of artillerymen in their use. This head start mattered enormously in 1914 when war came. The French 75 also represents the transition from the artillery of the 19th century to the artillery of the 20th. Before the French 75, artillery was primarily a tool for destroying fortifications and preparing attacks. After the French 75, artillery became a dynamic battlefield weapon capable of responding to threats and opportunities in real time. This conceptual shift was as important as the technical innovation that enabled it. The gun's limitations became apparent in trench warfare, and the French recognized them. The crash program to develop heavier artillery from 1916 onward showed French willingness to adapt. But even as 155 mm howitzers and heavy guns became more important, the French 75 remained the backbone of French field artillery. Its rapid fire and reliability made it indispensable for the everyday work of suppressing enemy positions, supporting infantry attacks, and breaking up enemy assaults. The relationship between technology and tactics that the French 75 exemplified would become a dominant theme of 20th century warfare. The gun enabled new tactical possibilities. Rapid, accurate fire could break up attacks before they reached friendly trenches. Artillery could accompany advancing infantry, providing continuous support. Defensive fire could be shifted rapidly to meet threats. All of this required the technical capability to fire rapidly without repositioning. The French 75 provided that capability. One final story captures the essence of what made the French 75 special. At Verdun in 1916, a single French 75 battery commander kept a log of his unit's expenditure. In one 24-hour period, his 4 guns fired 2,247 shells. That's over 700 rounds per gun in a single day. The crews worked in shifts, but the guns barely stopped. Barrels overheated and had to be allowed to cool. Ammunition had to be brought forward continuously. But the battery maintained fire, supporting French infantry holding a critical sector. This wasn't exceptional. This was routine for French 75 batteries at Verdun. Thousands of guns maintaining this kind of fire rate for months. The logistical achievement of keeping those guns supplied with ammunition was as impressive as the technical achievement of designing the guns in the first place. The French 75 fired its last shots in anger sometime in the 1950s in various minor conflicts and colonial operations. By then, it was hopelessly obsolete. But for 60 years, from 1897 to the late 1950s, the French 75 had been in service somewhere in the world. No other artillery piece of its era matched this longevity. In the end, the French 75 delivered a rate of fire that no army expected because no one had imagined it was possible. Colonel Duport and his team created something genuinely revolutionary. They didn't just improve existing artillery, they invented a new category of weapon. The quick-firing field gun would dominate battlefields for decades, and it all began with Miss 75, Mademoiselle 75, the French 75. When that Bavarian infantry regiment rose from their trenches in September 1914 and advanced toward French positions, they had no idea what awaited them. They'd faced artillery before, but they'd never faced artillery that could fire 20 rounds per minute without pause. The 4 French 75s that destroyed them in minutes demonstrated what the future of warfare would look like. Fast, mechanical, devastating. The French 75 changed the rules. It made artillery a weapon of annihilation rather than attrition, and in doing so, it helped shape the course of World War I and influence military technology for generations. That's the legacy of the gun that fired faster than anyone thought possible. The gun that was supposed to be impossible, the French 75. The legacy of the French 75 extends far beyond its direct combat use. The gun represented a fundamental shift in how militaries thought about firepower, logistics, and industrial mobilization. When the Great War began, European armies discovered that modern warfare consumed ammunition at rates that would have been incomprehensible just 2 decades earlier. The French 75 was both a cause and a symptom of this transformation. In August 1914, French military planners estimated that the war would last perhaps 6 months. Ammunition reserves were calculated accordingly. Each French 75 had approximately 1/300 rounds allocated to it in stockpiles. This seemed generous. Previous wars suggested that artillery expenditure would be measured in dozens of rounds per gun per day, perhaps a few hundred during major battles. Reality destroyed these assumptions within weeks. At the Battle of the Marne, some French 75 batteries expended their entire initial allocation in less than a week. The average French 75 battery was firing 500 to 1,000 rounds per day during active operations. At this rate, France's entire pre-war ammunition stockpile would be exhausted in months. Albert Thomas, who became France's Minister of Armaments in 1916, described the crisis in stark terms. In September 1914, France was producing roughly 20,000 shells per day. By September, French 75s alone were firing an average of 50,000 shells per day. The mathematics were unsustainable. France was consuming ammunition 2.5 times faster than it could be produced. The response was extraordinary. The French government mobilized the entire industrial economy for shell production. Automotive factories, metalworking shops, chemical plants, textile mills, all were converted or adapted to produce shells, propellant, fuses, and cartridge cases. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. By 1917, nearly 1.7 million French workers were employed directly in armaments production. Of these, over 400,000 were women. The shell crisis of 1915 affected all combatant nations, but it hit France particularly hard because the French 75 consumed ammunition so rapidly. Britain and Germany, with more diverse artillery parks including many heavier guns with slower rates of fire, faced slightly less extreme consumption rates. But France had bet everything on the 75. When shells ran short, entire sectors of the front went silent. General Joffre sent increasingly desperate telegrams to Paris. Without ammunition, attacks were impossible. Without attacks, the war would be lost. The political crisis nearly brought down the French government. Prime Minister René Viviani was forced to reshuffle his cabinet. New ministers took control of munitions production with extraordinary powers. By mid-1915, the crisis was being resolved through sheer industrial mobilization. New factories came online, production processes were streamlined, quality control improved. By the end of 1915, France was producing over 100,000 shells per day. By 1916, production exceeded 200,000 shells daily. France was now producing shells 4 times faster than it had been consuming them in the opening battles of the war. This industrial transformation had profound implications. The French 75, designed in the 1890s as a tactical weapon for field armies, had become a strategic weapon that reshaped entire economies. The gun's appetite for ammunition drove innovations in manufacturing, labour organisation, transportation, and logistics that would influence industrial practice for decades. The ammunition itself evolved throughout the war. The original 1897 shrapnel shell contained 300 lead balls, each about the size of a large marble, packed in a matrix of resin. A time fuse ignited a small bursting charge that scattered the balls forward in a cone-shaped pattern. Set correctly, the shell would burst above and slightly in front of enemy troops, raining steel down on them. This was devastating against infantry in the open, but nearly useless against troops in trenches or bunkers. The high-explosive shell used melanite, a picric acid-based explosive that was powerful but temperamental. Melanite was sensitive to shock and could detonate prematurely if the shell struck something hard. It also corroded brass cartridge cases over time, making long-term storage problematic. Nevertheless, high-explosive shells became the standard ammunition once trench warfare began. By 1916, French chemists had developed improved explosives and fuses. Schneiderite, a mixture of ammonium nitrate and dintronephthalene, proved more stable than melanite and nearly as powerful. New impact fuses with multiple redundant detonation mechanisms reduced the number of dud shells. Gray's fuses that detonated on the slightest contact were developed for cutting barbed wire. Chemical shells appeared in 1916. Early versions used tear gas or irritants, but these proved ineffective. By 1917, French 75 batteries were firing shells filled with phosgene, a choking agent that was colourless and difficult to detect until it was too late. Later came mustard gas shells, containing a blistering agent that caused horrific chemical burns and could persist in the environment for days. The French 75's rapid rate of fire made it ideal for gas attacks. A battery could saturate an area with hundreds of gas shells in minutes, overwhelming enemy gas defences. German soldiers dreaded French 75 gas barrages. The shells arrived so quickly that putting on masks became nearly impossible. By the time the third or fourth shell burst, you'd already inhaled enough to be incapacitated. One German account from 1918 describes a French 75 gas attack near Reims. The attack began at dawn. Within 2 minutes, over 300 gas shells had landed in the German trench. The phosgene concentration became so high that standard gas masks couldn't filter it all. Men began choking and collapsing. The attack lasted 10 minutes. Over 400 shells were fired. Casualties exceeded 200 men, with 47 dead. The survivors were evacuated, leaving that sector of the trench unmanned. This was chemical warfare at its most effective, and the French 75's rapid fire made it possible. A slower firing gun would have given defenders time to don masks and take cover. The French 75 struck too fast for effective response. The gun's mobility also proved crucial as the war evolved. In 1917 and 1918, warfare became more fluid. The static trench lines of 1915-1916 gave way to mobile operations, attacks and counterattacks, advances and retreats. Artillery that could keep pace with infantry became essential. The French 75, at just over 2,500 pounds with its carriage, could be moved by a 6-horse team or towed by trucks. Compared to heavier guns requiring tractors or rail transport, the 75 was remarkably mobile. French doctrine emphasised this mobility. When infantry advanced, French 75 batteries advanced with them, setting up new positions to support the next phase of the attack. During the German Spring Offensive of 1918, this mobility saved the Allied line multiple times. As German stormtroopers broke through French and British positions using infiltration tactics, French 75 batteries conducted fighting retreats. They'd fire until German infantry got within 1,000 metres, then limber up and retreat to a new position. Set up, fire again, retreat again. This mobile defence bought time for reserves to arrive and stabilise the line. The American involvement brought its own chapter to the French 75 story. When the United States declared war in April 1917, the American Expeditionary Force began arriving in France with virtually no modern artillery. The US Army had been operating with weapons that would have been considered obsolete in 1900, let alone 1917. General John Pershing, commanding the AEF, made a pragmatic decision. American forces would use French and British artillery rather than waiting for American weapons to be designed and produced. For field artillery, this meant the French 75. The French provided training, manuals and instructors. American officers attended the French artillery school at Verdun. American crews learned to operate, maintain and employ the 75 under French tutelage. The first American artillery unit to fire in combat was Battery C of the 6th Field Artillery Regiment. On October 23, 1917, near Bathlemont in Lorraine, Sergeant Alex Arch of South Bend, Indiana, pulled the lanyard on the gun nicknamed Bridget. The shell, a high explosive round, was aimed at a German position about 4,000 meters away. American artillery had entered World War I. By November 1918, over 1,800 French 75s equipped American artillery units in France. Some were French-built guns transferred from French stocks. Others were produced by American manufacturers. The complexity of licensed production created enormous challenges. Singer Manufacturing, Symington Anderson, and Wisconsin Gun Company all struggled with the hydro-pneumatic recuperator mechanism. The tolerances were so tight, the design so sophisticated, that American manufacturers initially had failure rates exceeding 50%. Eventually, American engineers mastered the design. Production reached 12 guns per day by mid-1918. But the war ended before domestic production could meet all American needs. The vast majority of French 75s used by the AF were French-manufactured guns. American artillerymen praised the weapon. Lieutenant Harry Truman, commanding Battery D, 129th Field Artillery, 35th Division, wrote to his fiancée Bess Wallace describing his first experience firing the French 75. "The gun is a marvel. It barely moves when fired. The crew can load and fire as fast as they can move. We fired 500 rounds yesterday in training. The barrels got so hot we had to pour water on them, but they kept working perfectly." During the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September-November 1918, American artillery fired over 4 million shells, the majority of them 75mm rounds from French 75s. American batteries supported the infantry advance with rolling barrages, walking walls of exploding shells that moved ahead of attacking troops at a pace of 100 meters every 4 minutes. French 75s made these barrages possible. Heavier guns couldn't fire fast enough or traverse quickly enough to maintain the precise timing required. One particular American action demonstrated the French 75's capabilities in American hands. On September 26, 1918, during the opening day of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, elements of the 17th Division attacked German positions near Montfaucon. German machine gun nests in the village were holding up the advance. Captain Edward Allworth, commanding a French 75 battery, moved his 4 guns into direct fire positions, essentially using them as assault guns. At ranges under 1,000 meters, the French 75s fired high explosive shells point blank at the German positions. The combination of rapid fire and pinpoint accuracy was devastating. In less than 15 minutes, the battery expended 320 rounds and destroyed 13 machine gun positions. The infantry advanced. Allworth received the Distinguished Service Cross for the action. This direct fire role, using the French 75 as essentially a large-caliber machine gun against point targets, became increasingly common in 1918. The gun's flat trajectory and rapid fire made it effective against bunkers, machine gun nests and buildings at ranges where heavier artillery couldn't be employed safely. As the war ground toward its conclusion in November 1918, the French 75 had become ubiquitous on the Western Front. French forces fielded thousands of them. American forces depended on them entirely for field artillery. British forces had captured and pressed into service hundreds of French 75s. Even the Germans were using captured French 75s, designated 7.5 by Simter's FK-97F, for training and secondary roles. The armistice on November 11, 1918 left the victorious powers with enormous stocks of artillery. France alone had over 5,000 French 75s in service. The United States had nearly 2,000. What to do with all these guns became a question of post-war policy. The French kept most of their 75s in service. The gun had proven itself, and France couldn't afford to re-equip with entirely new artillery. Modifications were made. Pneumatic tyres replaced wooden wheels, allowing truck towing. Improved sights extended effective range. The gun was updated but retained in service as France's primary field artillery piece. The United States took a different approach. Most French 75s were declared surplus and put in storage. The regular army retained a few for training, but the massive wartime artillery force was demobilized. However, the US kept detailed technical documentation and manufacturing tooling. If another war came, Production could resume quickly. This proved prescient. When World War II began in 1939, the French 75 was still in French service and still in American storage depots. Neither nation had the resources to completely re-equip with modern artillery during the Depression years. The French 75, though increasingly obsolete, remained ready for war. The guns saw extensive service in the interwar period in various conflicts. Polish forces used French 75s during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919–1921. The gun's mobility proved valuable in the fluid warfare across the Eastern European plains. Polish horse artillery batteries, equipped with French 75s, provided fire support for cavalry operations. In the Spanish Civil War, from 1936 to 1939, both sides used French 75s. The Republican government had purchased French 75s in the 1920s. The nationalist forces captured some and received others from various sources. The gun's rapid fire proved valuable in supporting infantry attacks and breaking up enemy concentrations. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Polish artillery batteries fought desperately against overwhelming German forces. Polish French 75s engaged German tanks, infantry, and artillery. The 75mm armor-piercing round could penetrate the side armor of early German tanks at close range. But the French 75 wasn't designed as an anti-tank weapon. Polish artillerymen fought bravely, but they were outmatched. The German invasion of France in May 1940 saw French 75s in action again, now against the military that had been their primary target when designed. The phony war period from September 1939 to May 1940 had seen limited artillery exchanges, but when Fulgelb, Case Yellow, the German offensive, began on May 10, 1940, French artillery went into action immediately. The French 75 was badly outclassed by 1940 standards. German artillery had longer range. German tanks could shrug off 75mm shells unless hit at close range on thin armor. German dive bombers could destroy artillery positions before the guns could be moved. But French artillerymen fought with skill and courage, and the French 75's rapid fire remained valuable for breaking up infantry attacks and providing defensive fire. The Battle of France lasted 6 weeks. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice. The Germans captured thousands of French 75s. Some were put into service immediately, others were stored or allocated to occupation forces. Many ended up on the Atlantic Wall, the German fortification system along the coast of Western Europe. The French 75, designed to attack German positions, now defended them. The Americans pulled the French 75 out of storage when war came to the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the US was desperate for artillery to defend against potential Japanese attacks and to equip units being sent overseas. French 75s went to the Philippines, to Hawaii, to Panama, to Alaska. They weren't modern, but they worked, and they were available. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces used French 75s during the desperate defense of Bataan and Corregidor. Outgunned and outnumbered, American artillery fought until they ran out of ammunition. One account describes a French 75 battery on Corregidor continuing to fire until the barrel split after firing over 10,000 rounds during the siege. The development of the M3 gun motor carriage brought the French 75 into the armour age, at least briefly. The M3 GMC mounted a French 75 on an M3 half-track chassis, creating a mobile tank destroyer. The gun retained its recoil system, meaning the entire weapon could fire from the vehicle without stabilising jacks. This was crude but effective. The M3 GMC served with US forces in North Africa in 1942 and early 1943, engaging German tanks and providing fire support for infantry. The 70 Famoleth Metters gun on the M3 GMC was actually designated the M1897A4, indicating the modifications made to adapt it for vehicle mounting. The barrel was shortened slightly. The breech mechanism was modified. The sights were changed. But the core weapon remained the French 75 design from 1897. Here was a weapon designed before the automobile was common, mounted on a tracked vehicle, hunting tanks. The transformation of warfare in 45 years was complete. By 1943, better tank destroyers were available, and the M3 GMC was phased out of frontline service. But it had served its purpose, filling a critical gap until purpose-built weapons were ready. Some M3 GMCs were transferred to Allied nations under Lend-Lease, Others were converted to personnel carriers or other roles. The French 75's final major combat use came after France's liberation. The Free French forces, fighting alongside the Allies, used French 75s that had been hidden, captured from the Germans, or received from Allied stocks. When French forces entered Paris in August 1944, some of the artillery providing fire support were French 75s, the same guns that had defended France in 1914 and 1940. By 1945, the French 75 was thoroughly obsolete. The US had standardized on the M2 and M3 105 howitzer. The British used the 25-pounder. The Soviets had an entire family of modern artillery. But the French 75 remained in service in various roles with various armies for years after the war ended. In the late 1940s and through the 1950s, French 75s saw service in colonial conflicts. French forces used them in Indochina during the First Indochina War. The gun's light weight made it suitable for the difficult terrain and limited infrastructure. French artillery positions in the highlands used French 75s because heavier guns couldn't be transported into position. During the siege of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, some French artillery pieces were French 75s that had been disassembled, carried in pieces by aircraft, and reassembled in the valley. They provided fire support during the desperate defence, though they were outranged by Viet Minh artillery positioned in the surrounding hills. When Dien Bien Phu fell, some of the guns captured by the Viet Minh were French 75s, ending their service with the nation that had created them. Various nations continued using French 75s into the 1960s for training, ceremonial purposes, or in secondary roles. The last combat use is difficult to pinpoint precisely, but French 75s were likely fired in anger somewhere in the world as late as the 1960s in minor conflicts or internal security operations. The technical influence of the French 75 extended far beyond the gun itself. The hydro-pneumatic recoil system became universal in artillery design. Every modern artillery piece uses some variation of the principle pioneered by Deport and his team. Hydraulic fluid absorbs the recoil energy. Compressed gas returns the barrel to battery. The gun carriage remains stable. This hasn't changed in over a century because the principle is fundamentally sound. The concept of the quick-firing field gun became standard. After World War I, every military wanted artillery that could fire rapidly, move quickly, and survive on the modern battlefield. The British developed the 25-pounder. The Germans developed the 10.5mm Leaf H-18. The Americans developed the 105mm howitzer. The Soviets developed the 70.6mm divisional gun. All of these weapons owed conceptual debts to the French 75. The emphasis on crew protection, pioneered by the French 75's gun shield, became standard. The importance of separate sighting systems that didn't require the gunner to expose himself to enemy fire became accepted doctrine. The value of reliable, fast-cycling breech mechanisms became a design priority. All of these lessons came from the French 75's success. The industrial lessons were equally important. The French 75 demonstrated that modern warfare required industrial mobilization on a scale previously unimagined. A successful military needed not just weapons but the industrial capacity to produce ammunition in millions of rounds. It needed trained workers by the hundreds of thousands. It needed transportation networks to move material from factory to front. It needed quality control systems to ensure reliability. The French 75 and the industrial infrastructure built to feed it became a template for total war. From a technical standpoint, the French 75 represented several firsts or near firsts in artillery design. It was the first field gun to successfully implement a long-recoil hydro-pneumatic system. It was among the first to use fixed ammunition, with the shell and propellant charge in a single unit. It pioneered the use of gun shields on field artillery. It demonstrated that rapid fire and accuracy could coexist if the weapon was designed correctly. The metallurgy required for the French 75 was cutting edge for its time. The barrel was made from high-grade steel capable of withstanding tens of thousands of firings. The recoil cylinders had to be machined to incredibly tight tolerances and made from steel that wouldn't deform under immense pressure. The breech block required precision machining and heat treatment to ensure it could cycle rapidly without failure. French metallurgists and engineers pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the 1890s. The mathematics of the recoil system were complex. The volume of hydraulic fluid, the diameter of the ports through which it flowed, the spring rate of the compressed gas, the weight of the recoiling parts, all of these had to be balanced precisely. Too much resistance and the gun would recoil too slowly, potentially damaging components. Too little resistance and the recoil would be too violent, defeating the purpose. The engineers at Puteaux worked out these calculations through trial and error, creating one of the early examples of complex mechanical systems engineering. The sighting systems on the French 75 were sophisticated for their era. The gun featured an independent line of sight telescope that remained fixed while the barrel recoiled and returned to battery. This meant the gunner didn't lose his aim when the gun fired. Earlier field guns required the gunner to re-aim after every shot. The French 75's independent sight was a crucial factor in its rapid-fire capability. Range-finding and fire control for the French 75 evolved throughout its service life. Early doctrine relied on direct fire, with the gun crew able to see their target. But as warfare evolved, indirect fire became more important. By 1916, French artillery doctrine emphasized firing from concealed positions at targets beyond visual range. Forward observers called in corrections. Maps and mathematical calculations determined range and bearing. The French 75 adapted to this new role, though its limited elevation restricted its maximum range compared to howitzers designed for high-angle fire. The training required to operate a French 75 effectively was substantial. A gun crew consisted of 6 to 8 men, each with specific duties. The gunner aimed the weapon and fired it. The loader placed shells in the breech. The ammunition handler prepared shells and handed them to the loader. The fuse setter adjusted time fuses for shrapnel shells. Other crew members handled ammunition boxes, made minor adjustments to the gun, and assisted as needed. A well-trained crew could maintain 20 rounds per minute because each man knew his job perfectly, and the choreography of loading, firing, and extracting was drilled until it became automatic. French and American artillery schools emphasized this crew coordination. Hours of practice with dummy ammunition built muscle memory. Crews competed to see who could fire fastest. Records were kept. Pride in battery performance drove men to perfect their technique. The physical demands were significant. Each 75mm shell weighed about 15 pounds with its brass cartridge case. At 20 rounds per minute, the loader was handling 300 pounds of ammunition every 60 seconds. Maintaining this pace for extended periods required strength and endurance. Crews rotated positions to prevent exhaustion, but during intense fire missions, everyone worked until the mission was complete or the ammunition was exhausted. The French 75's legacy in military history is secure. It was the right weapon at the right time, and its influence shaped artillery development for decades. But beyond the technical achievements and combat records, the French 75 represents something about how warfare transformed at the turn of the 20th century. When the gun was designed in the 1890s, warfare was still recognizable to generals from the Napoleonic era. Infantry marched in formation. Cavalry charged with sabres. Artillery limbered up, moved to new positions, and fired, slowly. The French 75 shattered these assumptions. It made infantry formations suicidal. It made cavalry charges impossible. It changed artillery from a supporting arm to the dominant killer on the battlefield. This transformation wasn't unique to the French 75. Machine guns, barbed wire, trenches, aircraft, tanks all contributed to the revolution in warfare between 1914 and 1918. But the French 75 was perhaps the purest expression of industrial age warfare. It took raw materials, metals, and chemicals and transformed them through precision engineering into a weapon that could fire shells faster than anything that had come before. It required industrial production to build. It required industrial mobilization to feed with ammunition, and it killed with mechanical efficiency that removed any romance from warfare. The gun also represented French military thinking at its best. The French High Command has been criticized, often justly, for tactical and strategic failures in both world wars. But the development of the French 75 showed French innovation, foresight, and technical excellence. The secret development program that created it was a masterpiece of project management. The engineers who solved the technical challenges were world-class. The decision to bet heavily on this weapon showed strategic vision. That the French 75 couldn't win the war alone, that France needed heavier artillery and many other capabilities, doesn't diminish the achievement. The gun did exactly what it was designed to do, devastatingly well. When German infantry attacked in the open, French 75s destroyed them. When fire support was needed, French 75s delivered it faster than any other gun could. When ammunition had to be fired in enormous quantities, French 75s were reliable enough to sustain the pace. In the final analysis, the French 75 delivered a rate of fire that no army expected because the gun represented a genuine breakthrough in military technology. The hydro-pneumatic recoil system was elegant, effective, and revolutionary. Everything else about the gun, the breech, the sights, the shield, the carriage, all were optimized to exploit this one crucial advantage. The result was a weapon that could fire 20 times per minute, when everything else could fire 2 or 3 times per minute. That advantage mattered. It mattered at the Marne in 1914 when French 75s helped stop the German advance. It mattered at Verdun in 1916 when over 1,000 French 75s held the line during the longest battle of the war. It mattered in countless smaller actions where rapid, accurate fire made the difference between success and failure. The French 75 was not perfect. It had limitations. Its light shell couldn't destroy heavy fortifications. Its limited elevation restricted its range. Its trajectory was too flat for effective indirect fire against some targets. But within its design parameters, as a rapid-fire field gun for engaging troops and light fortifications, it was extraordinarily effective. The sound of a French 75 battery in action became one of the defining sounds of World War I. A sharp crack repeated every 3 seconds, the mechanical rhythm of the breech cycling, the clatter of spent brass cartridge cases being ejected, the shouts of crew members coordinating their movements. This sound meant safety if you were behind the French lines, and terror if you were in front of them. Soldiers who served with French 75 batteries developed deep affection for the weapon. It was reliable. It rarely broke down. When maintained properly, a French 75 could fire thousands of rounds without malfunction. This reliability built trust. Artillerymen knew that when they pulled the lanyard, the gun would fire. When infantry called for fire support, they knew the 75s would deliver. The end of the French 75 story came not with a bang, but with quiet obsolescence. As armies modernized in the 1950s and 1960s, the remaining French 75s were finally retired. Some went to museums, others were scrapped. A few were preserved as war memorials. Today, surviving French 75s can be found in military museums around the world, silent reminders of a weapon that changed warfare. If you visit the right museums, you can still see a French 75. You can examine the recoil mechanism, though most display models have it sealed to prevent tampering. You can look through the sights, imagine aiming at targets kilometers away. You can touch the breech block, feel the precisely machined steel, and if you're fortunate enough to see a restoration in firing condition, you can watch the gunfire and understand viscerally what made it special. The barrel recoils smoothly back, then returns to position. The gun barely moves, and you understand. This was the gun that changed everything. The French 75 delivered a rate of fire no army expected. In doing so, it changed how wars were fought, how armies were organized, how industries mobilized. From 1897 through the 1950s, through 2 world wars and countless smaller conflicts, the French 75 served. It was the right weapon at the right time, and its influence echoes through every artillery piece built since. That's the legacy of Miss 75, the gun that fired faster than anyone thought possible.